Thank you so much, Andrea, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you all here. I'm sure people will be joining as we move along. I just want to start this morning by acknowledging where I sit, and I'll invite all of you to maybe think about where you are located. I live in what I know as Royal Roads. I might as well live in Royal Roads. I live in Victoria, and Victoria sits on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen and Kosamson families and their ancestors. I every day am reminded of how precious and how lucky we are to have this land, to have this ocean that has really been cared for by those families and ancestors and by the indigenous people who lived on these lands for millennia. And I just want to give thanks to that, real thanks to those people, those families, their ancestors, and future generations, and invite you to do the same wherever you live. We are very blessed and very really awestruck by how beautiful this place is that we work and live in and play in. I'm just going to stand up for a second and adjust my blinds so I'm not blinded by the sun. Hold on one sec. There we go. So with that, my name is Robin Cox, and I'm a professor here at Royal Roads. I'm also the program head of the Masters in Climate Action Leadership, and this webinar is part of a series that the MA in Climate Action Leadership program is sponsoring, focused on climate action, obviously, on leadership, and really focused at the intersection of disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. The MA in Climate Action Leadership McCall program is really a core component of Royal Road's commitment to climate action. We've just actually passed through our Board of Governors a robust and really ambitious climate action plan that the university will be speaking to over the next months. And really, climate action is fundamental to the core purpose of the university. We've been committed to sustainability for many years, and climate action is sort of a progression of that. And the program, the McCall program, is really focused on building skills, competencies that relate to leadership in climate action, both mitigation and adaptation, and really recognizing that the level of change, the systemic change that we need really requires leadership in all sectors, in all organizations, all businesses, all communities. And the McCall program is really designed to encourage that, support that with teaching and learning, and share that out through the world through an open pedagogical orientation. If you're interested in the program, we'll share the links later. So I'm really honored and thrilled to have the wonderful panel that we have today to talk about this idea of climate resilient wildfire recovery, this notion that we really have to start thinking about disasters, both in our preparation for them and in our response and recovery from them, as opportunities to absolutely apply a climate lens and try and build the kind of resilience, the social well-being, infrastructure resilience, ecological and social resilience that we need in the context of climate change, and also look for those opportunities for co-benefits where we can reduce emissions in the process of rebuilding, for example, in the context of wildfires. Today I have with me Chief Patrick Michell of the Kanaka Bar Indian Band. Chief Michell has lived in BC's Fraser Canyon all his life, and he's worked with his community of Kanaka Bar to establish foundational stabilities and really thinking forward, future thinking around air, water, food, shelter. And Chief Patrick Michell also recently was honored with a Clean 50 Lifetime Achievement Award, and Kanaka's 2021 Community Resilience Plan was also recognized by an award. He also has survived the Lytton fire, lost his home in the Lytton fire, and I'm sure he will talk to that in his initial remarks. We also have here today Tine Rossing. Tine Rossing is an accomplished professional with more than 25 years of technical expertise working at this intersection of biodiversity conservation, disaster risk reduction, climate change, and social justice for large international organizations governments and NGOs spanning about 32 countries. So we're very lucky to have Tina's international perspective, and she's speaking to us today from her home in Denmark. And finally, we have Dan Sandink. Dan is the Director of Research at the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. And since joining ICLR, Dan has authored and co-authored more than 50 technical reports and articles on topics related to protecting Canadians and their property from the impacts of extreme rainfall, urban flooding, high wind, wildland, urban interface fires, and hail. And really that, again, that work, which has been going on for many years, has just been amplified and accelerated, and needs to be amplified and accelerated even more as we face the growing impacts and risks that are associated with climate change. So, next slide, please. Today's webinar is running on until 10:30, and I'll begin with some introductory remarks. I'll try and keep those relatively short, just to provide some further context for our discussion. And then I'm going to invite each of our panelists to share their thoughts in short presentations, about 10 minutes long. We'll then engage in a panel discussion and open up some time for Q&A. And Andrea's already outlined where you can ask your questions, either in the chat or when we get to the Q&A, I believe you can raise your hand, but we'll review that just before we enter into that part of this morning. So with that, we'll launch into the webinar, and I'll just start with some remarks. We are recording this, as you've all been alerted to, I think, when you entered the room, and we will be sharing that link with you, with all the participants, you and all the panelists after the presentation. Next slide, please. So here we are. You know, we have a sort of history of facing challenges. Is this a slide from, whose slide is this? Andrea?
That'd be mine.
Yes, I think so. So I think there's a few slides missing. So we'll just hold off on this slide, and I'll just start by talking a little bit about where we're at and why we're talking about the Lytton fire. We know with climate change that disasters, natural hazard related disasters, extreme weather events, etc., are going to escalate, are already escalating. And any of you who have lived in BC and other parts of Canada this summer know that from the extreme heat, the heat dome that we experienced, and the long heat wave, and from the wildfires. And of course, one of the most devastating wildfires was the Lytton or Lytton Creek wildfire, which raged through that town, basically destroying the town and of course consuming a huge amount of the forest area. We have known about these kinds of events, and we've experienced these kinds of events for many years, for decades. And so wildfires are not new to us. Wildfires or interface urban fires are not new to us. But what is happening in climate change is that these are the fuel, the heat, etc., is accelerating. And this is not all due to climate change. Some of it is due to wildfire management and forestry management practices that have not served us well. We've deviated over the decades from some wildfire management strategies and techniques that Indigenous First Nations people have used for centuries very effectively. And we're actually starting to come back to some of those strategies, recognizing that the ways in which the dominant culture has managed fires has not served us well, and is actually escalating the risks of wildfire and wildfire damage. And with wildfire come other natural hazard risks, such as flooding and landslides. And I know in the case of Lytton that those have also come to pass. So as we think about disaster management and disaster recovery, a lot of our disaster management to date has focused on responding. And of course, that's essential. In the last maybe decade, probably a bit less, there's been an increasing emphasis on disaster risk reduction, at least rhetorically, and certainly the Sendai framework, which is a large global agreement around disaster risk reduction and resilience, has sort of spearheaded that movement towards disaster risk reduction. However, we've got a long way to go with that. And in the process, we have an opportunity, again, to look at disaster recovery and really integrate a climate lens into the recovery process in ways that anticipate that we will be experiencing more of these events, and understand that we have, in the tragedy and suffering of fire like Lytton, where people have lost homes and businesses, the town has lost its records, and people have been displaced and dispersed across the province and elsewhere, and will be displaced for some time. In that context, we have both an urgent need to get people housed and support them returning to something close to normal life. But we also have an opportunity and a responsibility to explore how we rebuild, and rebuild in ways that support the ongoing resilience of the community through our choices of building materials, through our choices around water and other infrastructure, through our choices about where and how we build. We have an opportunity to weave in resilience to the current risks, and weave in resilience to the future risks that are coming towards us as the climate changes and as the global warming increases. And we know some of those risks are locked in. The climate, even if we were to stop all fossil fuel production and reduce all greenhouse gas emissions to our goal of net zero today or tomorrow, there are still risks that are locked in because of the slowness of the climate to adjust to that. So we have an opportunity to really consider how we build in a climate lens to support that resilience moving forward. And this talk really is to explore that, to explore what the context is like on the ground, and in the context of both Kanaka Bar and Lytton, and in the broader sense, those affected by wildfires, to explore where there are some opportunities and some barriers and challenges to those opportunities to make changes, and explore some practices that have been employed in other contexts, including the international context. So with that, I'm going to turn first to Chief Patrick Michell and ask him to share with us his thoughts on where we're at and what the context is currently in Lytton and in the context of wildfire recovery. Chief Michell?
Excellent. And Dr. Cox, thank you for that opening. And you asked me, where are we at? Well, on the adoption curve, Canada is a laggard. We are so far behind. I'm not going to mince any things. We knew what was coming, but we chose not to do anything about it. Okay. In my opening slide, I said, hey, look, in 1988, the world scientists said, hey, anthropogenic climate change is occurring. Stuff's going to start happening. 1992, you got Severin Suzuki down at Rio at the very first big gathering saying things are happening. Ecosystem shifts are changing. Ecosystems extirpation events are changing. So we already had by 1992 the warnings, right? Kanaka Bar took it seriously. When we applied for a water license in 1990, we went out on the land and we started seeing the ecosystem shifts as animals were starting to migrate away from my territory. For example, all you have to do is read anything today about the wild salmon populations of the Fraser River. 5 species are extirpation level events. And yet we still seem to be doing very little. And I'm not saying we're not doing something, we're just doing very little. When you talk about what we're going to need to do today in order to prepare our communities for 1.5, 2, 3, 6. In Kanaka Bar's climate change assessment report, we're preparing for a 6-degree change because climate change's global temperature is also site specific. When you're already Canada's hotspot, we're not going to change by 2 degrees. We're forecasting a potential 6-degree change by 2050. So what happened was in June, Lytton weather station recorded 49.6 degrees. And that had followed a series of that heat dome you spoke about. So we had 5 weeks of just this incredible heat. Then there was no rain. And then we had that wind. So what we had here then is, get ready, the new norm that was warned about. Every community in BC and Canada are now facing down their own extreme weather events, be it flooding, be it fire, be it freeze up, be it landslide. So everybody is facing down their extreme weather event. So you probably should invest in proactively in protecting your houses and your infrastructure from extreme weather events. And again, these things are going to be very localized. So what we have then is Lytton is set up for this incredible scenario where Canada's hotspot, and then it happened. Next slide, please. All right, so what we have here, I'm not going to speak necessarily, because we still don't know what's going on. That's all I'm saying is that it was unprecedented, the amount of damage. We still have people in Lytton living in hotel rooms, in RVs, everywhere. 1,200 plus people, 450 First Nations and 800 non-First Nations people have been displaced. Everybody's trying to get home, right? 5 on IR-17, 35, 5. So what is that? That's 35, 40, 45 homes burnt down for the Indigenous population. And the problem is the village of Lytton itself, they're just toast. Google has updated its map. If you want to see what it looks like, just go on Google. There's no ban on going here and seeing what the end of result, but it's not just Lytton. I'm certainly, and I'm not aware, Barrier burnt, West Kelowna burnt, Santa Rosa's burnt, Paradise Valley's burnt, Fort McMurray burnt. So what we have here is, there was a warning. Everybody's at risk. You should probably do something about it. And that calls that proactive investment. I like to say, you can't build a reservoir and a fire hydrant while your house is burning. So at Kanaka Bar, we built in reservoirs and new water lines. So I just wanted you guys to understand that this is the effects. And Lytton was trying, Lytton was fire smart. Both Lytton First Nations and the village of Lytton was fire smart. What we did here, it wasn't a wildfire that burnt Lytton, it was a grass fire that got to Lytton. And this is going to be, it's going to be all part of that analysis. You've got everybody studying what happened. A grass fire got to Lytton. Lytton has had fires before. Gammy's burnt down in 1982. You've got Sandy Sanderson's garage. So you look at these things. Individually, fires have hit. How did the Lytton not burn down before? Because they weren't dealing with the new normal, this extreme heat and not lack of moisture and the winds that come. So I just wanted you guys to see here is that I can tell you this, that BC Hydro was out for 21 days and they've got the hydro back on. And of course, everybody's fridges and freezers were rotten. The hot water tanks boiled dry for the houses that didn't burn. The panic that kicked in because everybody was on Facebook. So it was a pretty gnarly June 30th. Is nobody knew what was going on because one of the first things that went was electricity. Second was communication. Next slide, please. Swamped. So as a result of this, not only did Kanaka Bar, 18 kilometers south, have overwhelmed, I've lost my finance staff. They couldn't handle the pressure. So as of effective June 30th, I don't have a finance staff. It's way too much work. We're all sitting here going, hey, there's Chief Patrick. He's got nothing but time in his hands. Really? I'm something like 9,000 emails behind. Most of you are too. And that was before June 30th. Can you imagine what it's like now? So we were not ready. So this is a simple presentation I did back for the engineers and geoscientists of BC. What we do to the land produces cumulative effects. Cumulative effects is producing global warming, and global warming is producing those extreme weather events, which produces impacts. Change your impacts, change your cumulative impacts. So we have an opportunity to stop burning fossil fuels as an example. Harm reduction, harm reversal. Everything at Kanaka Bar is looked at through the lens of climate change. Will this exacerbate global warming? Will this exacerbate extreme weather events? So watch your impacts. Change the way you're doing business now and then invest in your future. So future-proof your homes and your supporting infrastructures, because just as Dr. Cox said, inertia and lag time means it's going to get worse before it can get better. And if we don't do anything today, it's going to get worse than worse. I remember reading the title of a book, From Inhospitable to Inhabitable, a while back, but I lost that in a house fire the other day, so I haven't read that one, but I may get around to reading it someday. But it wasn't just us, everybody, EMBC, Indigenous Services Canada, ESSS, everybody's ready to deal with one emergency. What about an entire town and 84,000 hectares of fire? Nikamat, Cooks Ferry Band, Shakan, LNIB, the city of Merritt. Everybody was hit hard by this. But it wasn't just this fire. It was this, how did the title was? The Summer of Fire. There are fires throughout BC ongoing. We didn't just lose Lytton, we lost other homes. So I wanted to just end this slide with, holy cow, you guys, what are we going to do? Do we persevere or give up? Well, I'm Chief Patrick, damn it. Let's roll up our sleeves and take care of business. Next slide, please. Oh, continuing, just wanted to warn you guys, the recent IPCC report is the first time I've seen somebody actually warning, you might be hit by a fire one day and a flood the next and a freeze up the next day. That's consecutive extreme weather events. So one after another. Scary is about what happens, and I've seen it once where there's a fire in a mountain and a flooding on the other side. That's concurrent. So your response mode is now getting seriously curtailed. We can put out a fire, but we can't get there because of the flooding. So again, the need to start investing in tomorrow, to find ways to protect our transportation corridors so we can get to the people who need this, that we can communicate to the people in need here. So when we talk about the physiological foundations, air, water, food, shelter, we have to consider also the systems, which is energy, transportation, and communications. And I'll find a fourth one somewhere along the way because I think in force. So what I thought was interesting at Dr. Cox's beginning said the duration could be 10 years to rebuild Lytton. Wow. Tell that to the 1,200 displaced people that they may not be able to return home for 10 years. Woo, scary. Last week, the power was out twice because the trees that burnt are now falling on the power lines. It's not over. Next slide, please. So what then is this concept of resilience? Well, resilience, the opportunity to unify for the federal government, the provincial government, the municipal government, the regional district, for First Nations to get together and start working. June 30th, 2021 represents a catalyst. If we won't go willing into this thing, then you better be dragged into this. We need to be working together. British Columbians and Canadians need to be all in the same boat, facing the same direction, all with a paddle. And if I have to be in the back saying, row, I'll do that, because it's our children and grandchildren. In the opening picture, I have my daughter and 2 of my 16 grandchildren. We're there. The reason why we get up and do things, if you're looking for the why do we need to do this? Because isn't your children and grandchildren important? Do we need to set aside this wallet for our children? Yes, you need to. And it's not a cost to invest in your children and grandchildren. It's an investment. So we manage the land and resources at Kanaka Bar and within the Nation based on sustainability principles. And we practice forest fire hazard reduction by burning, by pruning, thinning, and burnings. And we do that every year at Kanaka Bar. We've created, we have a ribbon cutting ceremony on October 21st, and the very first of our resiliency centers, which again is a community building powered by the sun with battery storage. So that it's a cooling center in the summer, it's a warming center, and it has air purifiers if air quality is bad. One of the things we all have to learn is to stop taking for granted or assuming the quality of life. That is the one thing that's changing. BC and Canada is not facing end of life. We're facing extreme changes in quality of life. The assumption is we'll always have air, water, food, shelter. Ask anybody from Lytton, that doesn't exist anymore. So the opportunity to do something amazing. I did a Vancouver Sun story where I described climate change's extreme weather events as a wolf. It comes across straw homes and tears it down. It comes across stick homes and infrastructure and it tears it down. Well, now we have an opportunity to build brick homes and infrastructure. And I'm really looking to see how Tina and Dan address that opportunity. So thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm just as excited as the rest of you. And thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Chief Mitchell. I think really important context setting, particularly given that we know, well, certainly in the Lytton fire, but generally that First Nations, Indigenous communities are on the front line, are often, face longer displacement, longer timeframes in terms of rebuilding, et cetera. And that 10-year idea, I responded to the Wood Buffalo fire and did some research there afterwards. And we know from watching other fires that people will return, and they'll return before 10 years. But rebuilding a community is people rebuilding and infrastructure and redeveloping those social networks, et cetera. And that takes a lot of time. And for many people, for anyone I've talked to, often the recovery process is both complex and can be as or sometimes more traumatic and stressful than the actual event itself. People often talk about this, and in recent years, we've talked about building back better. And as you've referred to, we have had numerous reports after the what was it, the McClure fire and the Okanagan Park fire. We had the Philman report making some damning remarks about how we had or had not prepared and making recommendations. We had the Abbott-Chapman report in 2017 fire season, which spoke of some progress made, but again, made like over 100 recommendations about how things needed to be improved, including coordination with Indigenous peoples and communities, improving coordination generally, both on the ground, but also within government, sort of busting the silos between government departments, enhancing communication and awareness, et cetera. And so we've had this idea that obviously we need to be doing better, that there's this notion of building back better. And so I'm going to shift to you, Dan, working as you do, researching these events and looking at what and how we can change things in order to increase resilience and reduce the costs of disasters. What changes are needed in things like building codes and regulations? What are the possibilities there? And what does build back better mean realistically? I mean, we can have some grand ideas about it, but what can we and should we be doing? Turn it over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Professor Cox, and thank you.
And you can all call me Robin.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Chief Mitchell, for the excellent opening comments. I'm just going to share my screen here. So I'm going to talk about our work, which is a bit more broad than wildland fire specifically, but I think there are lessons that are relevant for any extreme event. In Canada, we find that most of the sort of recorded impacts of disasters, which often is economic impacts, insured losses, are associated with homes, personal property, that sort of thing. The experience of Chief Mitchell and those actually impacted by disasters is often not well recorded and reflected in policy. And I think a lot of things that we're talking about displacement, long-term displacement, just dealing with the recovery process, having your home rebuilt. We overlook these impacts in disaster risk reduction planning and research and so on, and they're really important to bring to bear. So a few points I'm going to make. First, with respect to disaster resilient construction, we have made a fair bit of progress in the last 5 years in terms of technical guidance for protection of buildings and infrastructure from the impacts of climate change. Notably, the Pan-Canadian Framework, which was released about 6 years ago, included a strategy related to addressing resilience in construction infrastructure codes. And coming out of that work, a huge amount of work was funded by groups like National Research Council and Standards Council of Canada to develop new guides and standards and to adjust codes and standards to reflect climate change impacts. This slide is showing you a small sample. These are examples that I've been involved with personally. Green is high wind and hail, blue is flood, red is wildland fire, black is sort of general topics like durability in buildings. But the point is that there are many resources now available. There's a lot of stakeholders involved in developing these resources, and there's differing opinion about their sort of adequacy for direct implementation. But we have resources now that should be applied on the ground, at least piloted and tested, so that we can bring them to the into wider adoption in normal construction practice. So I just wanted to point out that, first of all, there are not really technical barriers to building back better. In fact, we have consensus documents, National Standards of Canada readily available, that can be applied to increase resilience. One specifically related to our discussion today is the National Guide for Wildland Urban Interface Fires, which was released just a few weeks ago by National Research Council. We worked with National Research Council to conduct the benefit cost assessment for this guide. So this guide covers the full gamut of wildfire protection for communities, from buildings, specific building materials, building construction design, vegetation and fuel management at the property scale, going out to the landscape scale, and then also various factors related to community design that facilitate response and that sort of thing. So our cost benefit assessment relied on data from the US from the Campfire, notably, which is the chart below there. It shows you sort of the relative impact of different building practices on likelihood of buildings being lost. And what we found, that the study was led by Dr. Keith Porter, was that application of the Wildfire Guide for Canada for new construction of homes, including reconstruction of damaged homes, would be 34-1. So the return on investment would be 34-1. In high hazard areas. In moderate hazard areas, including sort of central BC, the return on investment would be 5-1. For retrofit, the return on investment was 14-1 in high risk areas and 2-1 for moderate risk areas. And that's just construction practice specifically. So specific building materials that are more expensive and so on. And we found also that fuel vegetation management has much better benefit cost ratio than the construction measures. And an overall wide application of the guide would generate 4-1 benefit cost ratio for Canada generally. And we looked at societal benefits that include direct loss of buildings, the cost of direct loss of buildings, as well as a number of societal factors like post-traumatic stress, morbidity, mortality, that sort of thing, but not covering all of the potential impacts of disasters, such as long-term displacement, contamination of soils, greenhouse gas emissions associated with loss of buildings and reconstruction of buildings, solid waste management, so on, having solid waste, new solid waste introduced into landfills and that sort of thing associated with disasters. All of those impacts are left out, which indicate that these are conservative outcomes. So even though these are conservative findings, very, very strong argument to adopt wildfire risk reduction as a course of normal practice. So why is the post-disaster period important? I think in general, there's common sense that this is a good time to implement disaster risk reduction. First, there's obviously a high interest in mitigating future loss, both by individuals directly affected and by decision makers. So we have a series of case studies, which you can check out if you're interested. We have 100 case studies of municipal actions to reduce disaster losses and apply climate change adaptation. And we found that in many cases, communities apply disaster risk reduction only after disasters occur. And a lot of that planning occurs sort of in the 12 to 18 month period following disaster events. So clearly it's a key window of opportunity for risk reduction. Another important factor is that buildings are damaged. Repair can include resilience measures. There are economies of scale associated with applying these measures and rebuild. So specifically, for example, if you're ordering a large amount of materials to rebuild buildings, you can get good deals on that materials, which will offset the cost of more expensive materials. And we actually saw that in Barrie with a few insurance companies doing build back better practices. Also, your trades are on the ground. They're already there. There's tens or hundreds of millions of dollars mobilized. The incremental cost we know of disaster resilience for the key measures is not very substantial. You're looking at a few $1,000s per building, which a full rebuild is in the neighborhood of $1 million or possibly more, depending on additional living expenses and that sort of thing. And then we also know that if you're reconstructing buildings, if you're maintaining them, incorporating resilience is much less expensive than retrofitting. It's a very good window of opportunity. So these are the reasons why it's a good time to do it, but there are still barriers. So one is that interest in resilience is not always high. There's something called gambler's fallacy. So people experience an extreme event and they assume it was so extreme it won't happen again. An example of this is like a 100-year rainfall event in a city. The engineer goes on the news, says, well, that was a 100-year event way beyond our design capacity. And so people say, well, 100 years, then I'm good for 99 years. We all know it doesn't work that way, and with climate change impacts, these events are going to occur more frequently. The other important limiting factor is self-efficacy. So do people understand what the measures are? Do they think they're available to apply? Do they think they'll be effective? And do they think they can actually apply them themselves? So there's a lot of decision making, especially at the individual level, that goes into deciding whether or not you'll apply measures. And sometimes self-efficacy can be low and people don't apply these measures. On sort of the policy and planning side, there's often limited tolerance for new measures that are perceived to introduce new cost, complexity, and delays in reconstruction. So people want to get back to normal as quickly as possible. And we find that that's often a barrier, but we're making some headway. I'll give some examples later. Also, with respect to construction, in Canada, construction codes, so we're talking like building codes, plumbing codes, et cetera, these are considered minimum provisions for construction, the legal minimum, but they're regularly applied as both minimum and maximum. And so what you find is that municipalities are often not able to, say, apply a bylaw that requires construction practices that exceed building code requirements. And this is notably the case for Part 9 construction, which is low-rise residential, which is where we see most of the impacts of disasters. And related to that, we also know that construction codes and building codes do not expressly cover the topics of wildland and urban interface fire, inland and urban flood, extreme wind with some caveats, and hail. So you're not always in a position where you're working with construction codes and the building regulations where you can apply measures related to these hazards in a way that's acceptable, for example, to code officials. You can submit code change requests and say, argue for inclusion of these perils in codes, but the code change request process is conservative, it's technical, it's very long-term, and in general, it's not a place for new, innovative, untested ideas. The idea behind all of this work by Standards Council, National Research Council, initially anyway, was to move toward adjusting codes for disasters and climate change impacts. But the experience today is that it will be a slow process. That being said, there has been a few successes, actually a number of successes, and a few just to highlight here. So first, City of Calgary. So City of Calgary had a significant hail event last year in June 2020. And after that event, they developed a subsidy program for better reconstruction practice, specifically hail-resistant roof cover. That subsidy program has been widely adopted throughout Calgary. The map on the top right, the dots are showing you which homes use that subsidy program. So that was a voluntary program. It was not regulation. The city did not apply a bylaw. It was decided that in Calgary, the city didn't have the authority to do it, so they went with this voluntary method. They also applied education practices, and they've initiated a code change process for the National Building Code Alberta edition process, but this is an example of success following disaster. The town of Slave Lake also, there was resident mobilization of fire smart practices following the fire in Slave Lake years ago. And that was widely credited to a very effective education program that included residents and contractors. And there's a quote there from former Chief Gina Coots, straightforward things that they could do around their homes that didn't cost much. So that's getting at that self-efficacy barrier. And finally, City of Barrie, following the tornado just earlier this year, has now initiated subsidies, again, voluntary subsidies for wind protection practices, guidance for permit applications when permit applications are made for reconstruction, guidance for better building for wind and so on. So again, not the regulatory measures, but voluntary measures and significant progress in that area. With respect to opportunities in the short term, we need to use these disaster events to operationalize disaster resilience. It's one of the most effective times. But in order to do that, we have to be ready with the appropriate technical resources, the appropriate strategies. I think the standards and guidelines that are being developed now are being developed at the right time. Code officials, those in the building industry, they need these technical guides in order to actually do this work. Where regulation is not an option, we can apply voluntary approaches like education, financial subsidies. The example from Calgary shows that these can work. We're currently working with the insurance industry on post-disaster rebuild, incorporating disaster resilience in insured loss rebuild. I know that doesn't cover everybody, but it is a big part of the residential construction in Canada. And as I was saying before, the insurers are finding that resilience measures implemented post-disaster as part of a rebuild are very, very small incremental cost. You're looking at often somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 for $1 million rebuild process. So it's not a huge barrier. And another important area to engage is trades and contractors who can go out and promote resilience in their jobs. For example, during roof repairs, they can promote fire-resistant roof cover, impact-resistant shingles. We find that's been effective as well. In the long term, in order to get to the state where Canada is by default applying risk reduction in all construction, we need to continue to build a consensus through standards and guides. It's a long process, but it's really necessary in order to get this moved into regulation. And we still need to develop evidence. We need to understand efficacy and practicality of these resilience measures. There's still pushback from the industry on many of these measures. That includes things like post-disaster investigations, which were initiated on several cases. And also, importantly, piloting measures with progressive builders and insurers. This is a huge area of opportunity. On the bottom right is an example of a pilot program we were conducting with a builder in Ontario on high wind resistance. When builders can take this information and bring it back to their own industry, it has a lot more weight, and the industry will be more readily apply it, as opposed to when it's sort of promoted by what they consider to be interest groups, I think like us, the climate change adaptation community. So I'll end it there, and thanks again for involving me today.
Thanks so much, Dan. I think you've done a great job sort of highlighting both the fact that there has been some progress and there have been some good examples. As you say, it's most often, as so much of our culture is in a reactive sense, done after the damage is done as opposed to proactive. So there's clearly some examples, and we're going to hear more of those examples from Tina, but there's clearly a needed and demonstrated benefit of initiating some of those incentives of education. But there's this, and there's this paradox of the urgency of people wanting, understandable, wanting to return, to get their homes built, just get back to their lives. And the other side of the process, which is this, how do we consider how we do that in ways that contribute more to sort of long-term resilience. And that, you know, I think a key thing that you said was we have to be ready. We trying to do this, and I think Chief Patrick, you also said this. You know, you can't be trying to fill your reservoir in the middle of a fire, right? And yet we're often not ready. I know in the Chapman report, which I think was in 2017, they talked about we have 4 years to protect our investments while we're in 2021. And I think, you know, some of the comments in the chat, I'm not able to follow all of them, but Gareth Ainsley commented and said, you know, we have been considering incremental changes for decades, in large part, that have not been implemented, which I would agree with. And now more than ever, we need a paradigm shift and we need fundamental changes. And he asked a question about, you know, how can we allow for real creative solutions that introduce these kind of systemic changes and systemic, and I would say, and other changes. And so I want to move to you, Tina, because I know you have in your work internationally at this intersection of adaptation and biodiversity and disaster risk reduction, done some work in various places that maybe gives some other additional, in addition to some of the work that Dan was citing, some additional ideas about how this is possible. We know it's possible. And so it's helpful to sort of see how this is happening in other jurisdictions and you know, facing different and similar barriers. Tina?
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for the invitation to be part of this panel, and very privileged to be part of it with Chief Patrick and with Dan and with you, Robin. So, so as you were mentioning, I bring more of an outside perspective to this discussion because I spent most of my professional career working overseas. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to present some of the approaches that I've helped develop when I was CARE International's Global Climate Adaptation Coordinator. And for the ones of you who do not know that, CARE is a global humanitarian confederation. And it essentially works in 140 countries around the world to primarily end poverty through development and humanitarian organization of projects. So this presentation is built on some of the methodologies and processes that we developed as a team based on more than 15 years of work in disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and ecosystem management and restoration. And I can go into why a humanitarian organization like CARE is working in all these different sectors, but it is fundamentally because the standard humanitarian work that was focusing on water supply, on agriculture and whatnot, was really being threatened by disasters and climate change, and therefore essentially forced us to start considering what we were doing from that point of view. Next slide, please. So what I will try to cover in my presentation here, I will tell you a little bit about how we evolved to also increase community resilience to climate change. And then I want to talk a little bit more of the importance of resilience, because that's something that both Chief Patrick and Dan has already touched upon, but something that is, in our view, absolutely fundamental to building the capacity and the knowledge and all the skills that we need to prepare better for what's coming at us. As Robin was just saying, is like we need to be better prepared, but what does that really look like in real terms? And that then brings me to explaining what we mean by an integrated risk management framework. And then I will elaborate a little bit on what that connection is to what I have focused most on, which is community-based climate adaptation and also nature-based approaches to adaptation. And then I will show the connection between those. Next slide, please. So CARE has worked in disaster risk reduction since the early 2000s. And initially, it was mostly based on emergency relief and traditionally aimed at reducing the risk of natural disasters, primarily through what we refer to as disaster mitigation, disaster preparedness, and prevention. But then what happened was that over the years, the impact of climate change on the frequency and on predictability and the intensity of these disasters suddenly became a lot more evident. And that resulted in the inclusion of climate change adaptation measures in the practice of disaster risk reduction. And what really happened was that we had different arms within CARE that were focusing on different types of work. So we had one constituency that was looking at climate adaptation, and then we had another constituency that was working on disaster risk reduction. And in the beginning, there was a bit of mud throwing going on between us because we kind of felt that we were stepping a bit on each other's toes and competing for funds. But then we realized that adaptation more and more became, instead of just preparing ourselves for climate adaptation or climate change, we were also continuously looking at how adaptation is a continuous process. And then the disaster risk reduction folks were saying, well, wait a minute, we used to kind of think about disasters after the disaster. But then as Robin was saying, it began to become more and more apparent that it was really about preparing for a given disaster, not just looking at the aftermath that was important. So we realized that we were really two constituencies that would benefit immensely from coming together. So that's how we started to collaborate a lot more. Then what happened was in more recent years, then CARE began to consider natural hazards in the context of the, should we say, the wider environment. Because, for instance, ecosystems, they play a pivotal role in disaster risk reduction as they can work as a natural barrier against some hazards. So, for example, if you take mangrove forests that we worked on a lot, they can actually help reduce wave intensity, and healthy rangelands that we also have elsewhere in Canada. They are actually vital for groundwater recharge. They are also a vital resource for helping in the recovery in the aftermath of a disaster to essentially help build community disaster resilience. So as a result, we essentially saw within CARE that we had not only these two constituencies, but these three constituencies coming together, because we then started to embed more of the ecosystem thinking structurally across all the disaster risk reduction programs to help increase resilience. Next slide, please. So increasing resilience is essentially central to how care works. The approach is embedded across all of care's priority work areas. And to increase resilience, you essentially start with strengthening people's capacities to deal with shocks and stresses, to know when they can expect shocks to occur, and also to then manage these risks, and then finally to transform their lives in a response to new hazards and opportunities. And it's especially this whole notion of transforming that refers back to some of the points that you were making, Robin, where we are saying, well, it's not only enough to be prepared, but we essentially need some more transformative change to happen at a much more systemic level to keep preparing ourselves for increasing uncertainty and increasing level of drama and intensity in what's happening. So there's a lot of volatility and a lot of uncertainty, and to be prepared for that, you really need a very different way of approaching it with a forward-looking lens and more flexibility. So at the same time, care then also works on ensuring that people have the means to prepare and also to respond when disasters hit and when climate change impacts they strike. And this really ended up being formed into what we named as an integrated risk management framework. So I just want to stress that even though care focuses primarily on working with the poorest and the most marginalized communities and people around the world, what I personally find is that a lot of these principles that I'm going to be talking to are completely universal to everybody. It doesn't really matter of what your level is. Adaptation and impacts of climate change, the impacts are very what we call differential. It depends on where you're coming from and what your endowment to deal with it is, but we are all going to be affected in different degrees. Next slide. So the term integrated risk management, it essentially refers to a holistic, multidisciplinary way of managing risks and increasing community resilience. And you do this by integrating disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and then also ecosystem management and restoration efforts. So IRM is defined as, or we defined it as, the systematic process of reducing disaster risks through anticipative, absorptive, adaptive, and transformative actions, where we would then take into the account the effects of climate change and the role of ecosystems. And then you'll say, okay, that was a lot. So what does that really mean? But it really means that it addresses the drivers of risk, and I'll go into what that means a bit later, the capacities and assets of communities and individuals, and also then what we call the enabling environment. So this figure that you see here essentially illustrates the overlap between these different types of, or three different types of approaches where we are working in the intersection of all of them. So for example, the overlap means that we are working simultaneously on climate-related disasters, while we are also developing nature-based solutions and also working on communities' livelihoods within their given ecosystems in the location that we are at. So it's really about increasing these synergies by including more ecosystem management and climate adaptation into the basic DRR framework. For example, you can develop a better understanding of the relationship between or with flora and fauna. Or what is really important from a climate point of view is that you work across timescales and also across different administrative boundaries, because what we see often is that if you're in a given location, your political or administrative boundaries do not necessarily correspond with the ecological boundaries. So it's really important that you sometimes straddle more than just one area that you're in. So you might be looking at an entire rivershed or larger landscape to figure out what the key dynamics are from an ecological point of view that's then affecting these ecological or environmental hazards you're up against. And then, of course, then also include the subsequent adaptation measures. Next slide. So this is a bit of a mouthful or to digest, but I'll try to break this down. So this is really a slide that shows you what this integrated risk management framework looks like. So how do you build more resilience to climate change shocks and stresses? So according to this framework, you do it by essentially increasing drivers of risks, or no, not if you increase it. Resilience, sorry about that. Resilience is increased if drivers of risk that you're seeing to your left are reduced, and then the subsequent capacities and assets to deal with these various shocks, stresses, and uncertainties are then also built and supported. And finally, if all these actions are supported by an enabling environment. So how do these relate to each other? So the first part, which you're seeing on the left, that we characterize as, I can barely see it here, concerns the so-called drivers of risk. So communities and individuals, as you know, and especially as Chief Patrick was highlighting, they face these natural hazards that are then exacerbated by climate change and also degraded ecosystems. So together, these form the drivers of risks. And then the element therefore involves actions to reduce the likelihood of these shocks arising. So for example, it can be efforts to reduce carbon emissions by focusing more on driving electric cars, or well, all the different aspects that we can think of to reduce our GHG emissions. On the other hand, it can also be actions to address the conditions that increase people's exposure to shocks and stresses. So, for example, you can do that by investing in coastal protection infrastructure. And this is where it's really exciting that we're seeing a more and more tendency that instead of just using like concrete barriers and what we call gray infrastructure, we are more and more realizing that also using ecosystems and green infrastructure, and sometimes hybrid mixes between green and gray measures, are actually a lot more sustainable in the long run and effective. And then finally, it also involves to avoid exacerbating any existing risks or creating new ones. That brings you then to that middle level and the second part, and that concerns then the capacities and the assets to then deal with shock, stresses, and uncertainty. And if any of you have ever seen the Sustainable Livelihood Framework, you will recognize these different types of assets that I'm mentioning in the square in the middle. So it's really about increasing people's capacity to anticipate risks, absorb shocks, adapt to evolving conditions, and then transform whenever that's necessary. And these capacities, they are very strongly influenced by people's ability to access and control assets. And these assets then include economic, physical, natural resources, just as well as their social capital and human potential, which are also fundamentally important. Then the third and final part concerns what we call the enabling environment. And because communities and individuals, they form part of a larger environment, this particular approach requires the involvement of all relevant stakeholders, such as the surrounding communities, civil society organizations, the private sector, public authorities, and needless to say, I'm also including here indigenous communities, First Nations, and all different types of faith organizations that would benefit from this. Because working concurrently on the drivers of risk and the capacities and the assets and the enabling environment is really important to do at the same time if you want to make sure that you make some sustainable progress. And then the final point I just want to make here, you might see that there's some errors at the end or below these figures here. And that's essentially to highlight that resilience and building adaptive capacity and doing adaptation towards climate change is an ongoing process. It's not something you just do once and then you're done. And that's because change is a constant, as Patrick was referring to as well. And it just means that because the changes that we're up against are going to continue, it also means that we will need to essentially adapt and prepare for what's coming at us on a continuing basis. So that means that the framework also includes a consideration of how these risks will change over time. And you do that by essentially applying a forward-looking risk assessment. So instead of keep planning for the current situation, you need to make sure you continuously keep thinking ahead. What will this mean? You know, for instance, if we only are preparing for 1.5 degree temperature change right now, as Chief Patrick was referring to, what if it goes to 3 or what if it goes to 6? Well, then if we have only prepared for 1.5 degree change, well, then the train has already left the station. We are going to be toast. So it's really keeping an eye on projections and the trends and see what's going on and continuously modify our behavior accordingly. And then finally, resilience building requires flexibility to adjust. So because you have these changing circumstances, it requires that your planning processes are flexible so that you have that nimble ability to continuously change. And then the final point is that you also need to make sure you promote innovation. And that goes back to some of the things that Dan was highlighting, that this is a continuously, it's a learning process. And a lot of it is really learning by doing, where we need to continuously welcome and look for new approaches for how to do things. Next slide, please. So when I was working for CARE, we spent a long time. We were essentially, it's a process that ended up lasting more than 10 years in working with communities, for communities in the field on how do we deal with all these changes that climate change is throwing at us. And out of all that work in the field on the front lines, because I have worked in the Lyttons overseas, and a lot of the work that we were doing overseas essentially created a lot of learning that we ended up formulating into a long process that we called a community adaptation action planning process. And I don't really have the time to completely break down these 7 steps that is here, and I'll give you the source where you can find it if you would like a lot more details on it. But fundamentally, at the core of all this resilience work is a focus on planning. That being as a platform for facilitating community participation and empowerment, forward-looking and proactive strategies, and more trusting relationships between all the different actors whose collaboration is required for tackling climate change. I think both Chief Patrick and Dan and Robin and a lot of people who are working in this field will agree with me that one of the biggest challenges that we're up against is that we have a very sad tendency of working in silos. And we're just not talking to each other because we have this notion that, you know, as long as I do my little part, it's all going to be okay. But climate change and a lot of what that brings with it is, you know, we used to, many years ago, I've been in this field for more than 15 years. We used to look at it as an environmental problem. And now, of course, luckily, we know that it's a cross-cutting issue. And that really means that you have to involve all parties from all the different sectors that are involved in a given location to really come up with some meaningful solutions. So this means that the emphasis of this particular planning process that we came up with lies on action planning, so really tangible planning that can be carried out in real life, but at the community level, with communities, for communities. But then what can't be stressed enough is then also what we did afterwards is we ensure we work very carefully with all the different stakeholders to then integrate these plans into the local development planning processes that are broader at the local government level. So it's really what it looks like here when you're looking at this slide is that it looks like a stepwise approach, which it is. But at the end of the day, it really is an iterative process where you kind of jump between the different steps and you bring certain learning from one step into the other planning. But just to give you a little bit of what some of the key steps or key elements of this particular process is we used to do participatory vulnerability and capacity analysis to really get a firm grasp on what are we up against. And so we were doing mapping, hazard mapping, and capacity assessments, and not scenario planning there, but really trying to unpack what the challenges coming at us were. And then we would then start saying, okay, what are we going to do with all this? But before we would get into like the scenario planning mode, we will think, why don't we just take a step back and really come up with a community visioning process where we took a pause and said, what is it we want? What is it we would like this particular community to look like? A little bit if Chief Patrick got all his different stakeholders together and said, let's forget about what Lytton was like, but what would we really like Lytton to look like if we had absolutely no obstacles or barriers? Then you have your ideal vision. Then you start talking about the barriers and not the obstacles, but then you start coming down to the nitty-gritty about what can we do to get from point A to point B. And all this work is then carried out in a very participatory manner. And that means that everybody has to be involved from the beginning to essentially jointly co-create solutions that are then based on a set of jointly identified and agreed set of values. And then by having everybody at the table from the beginning, it really helps breaking down the silos. I'm not saying it's easy and it takes a while, but it's amazing what people have, we start getting a much better understanding of where everybody else is coming from.
Thank you so much, Tina.
I think I will stop here.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
I cut you off. I was just going to say, thank you. There's a lot of information here, and I've just had a request in the chat room that we'll be sharing the webinar recording, but
yeah, sure.
If you're willing, we can also share a PDF of your presentation, maybe the others, because there's a lot of really great information in thinking about integrated disaster management and risk management, and really thinking through what it means to actually do that on the ground in terms of the participatory nature, the iterative nature of it, and the many steps along the way, both long before ideally a disaster happens, and then as in the wake of a disaster, how we can sort of manage that. There's a lot of great conversation in the chat, and we can't respond to all of it, but I think perhaps what I'd like to do is, and maybe we can finish the slideshow, Andrea, and return to the sort of gallery view, and maybe just sort of allow for a bit of time for questions. I want to leave maybe 5 minutes at the end, or 5 or 7 minutes at the end, to ask each of you, Dan and Patrick and Tina, and so just giving you kind of a heads up about this, if there was one or possibly two things that you think would make a huge difference in this space, if you would offer those. But before that, let's just look at a bit of the stuff that's coming up in the chat and some of the questions. And we'll have a little bit, we've got about 20 minutes left, so we'll have a bit of time to discuss them. So a lot of the conversation has been around the resistance, the pushback. Why is there pushback on this? And what's stopping this from happening? Coming back again to that idea that we are seeing changes slowly. We are seeing these incremental changes, but we know in the context of climate change, we don't really have time for incremental. We need to move this forward if we are going to prevent the kind of tragedy that's happened in Lytton, but also happened in other communities. And even if we can't prevent the wildfire itself from happening, prevent the level of impacts that are being experienced. So I'll just open this up to anyone on the panel. What's the biggest barrier here? What is stopping us from moving this forward, whether it's large systems changes or building codes or whatever?
I'll chime in. I can tell you guys that at the outset, so we weren't ready. This is the big point. The systems that we rely on weren't designed for the magnitude of response required. Okay, get over it. Now let's use an example. I purchased a $4,000 tin can that I freeze off at night. Can I put it on my property? No, zoning bylaw prohibits the use of RVs. What do you mean I can't put my RV? For God's sakes, then create an exemption. Oh, that takes 6 months to a year. We have to have public consultation. I'm living in an RV now on an abandoned mill site because at least it was zoned industrial. There's no water and there's no septic, but at least I got electricity. So my frustration is the inability, relying on antiquated systems, and then the inability of decision makers to make timely decisions. What's the risk of me putting my RV on fee simple lands in my territory? Zero, but I can't do it. One of the things that we talked about here is then what's the pushback? And I call it simple change management, okay? Hey, let's do something different. No. Let's do something positive. No. Why? Because I like the system that exists. The very system that I've talked about that is not designed for the needs of tomorrow or today, let alone tomorrow, we don't want to change. So then let's look at change management and the fear and anxiety that comes from that and tell it to piss off. Okay, change management, there's no room left. We have 4 freaking years left before we exhaust the carbon budget. We should probably have been putting the remaining carbon budget into resiliency and proactive investments. Instead, we're building freaking pipelines. Has anybody seen the video where I told somebody in Ottawa to get a brand new pair of cojones? I was suggesting pants. Somebody just told me today from Colombia that it meant balls. Whoops, sorry, Trudeau. I mean, whoops, shouldn't have said that name. Watch that video. Where's the political will to advance us into tomorrow? It's missing. So what you do is you continue, and success at the adoption curve that I talked about. When I said that Canada, we're laggards, we should be at the forefront, but we're not. We don't look at AAC products because it doesn't involve wood, and there's right. We don't think about building resiliency centers, and I've shared my copy because we're building pipelines. What makes you think tripling our fossil fuel exports to the global market is consistent with a global existential crisis? It's crazy. Stop being crazy, or be crazy insane about proactive investments in our grandchildren and children. Right. I want to just end this little tirade with one saying: let justice prevail, though the heavens may fall. Look it up. You want to stop the insanity? Look it up and apply it to UNDRIP Article 32.2. That will change everything, but it won't happen.
Thanks, Patrick, for both the passion and I guess for the invitation for political will to shift. And I agree. I mean, the political will is not apparently there in the ways that we need it. Dan, do you have thoughts on this question?
Yeah, well, there's, I think a related question I saw in the comments was the discussion of the incremental versus transformational change. And, you know, it's all related to this. What's the pushback? How can we get this transformational change? I thought it was just a specific example. I thought it was interesting. So the Pan-Canadian framework was, you know, an overall strategy for national climate mitigation adaptation. And it's basically coming from the Prime Minister's desk. It's his directive. And in that document, just thinking about where we're working at, where I'm working, is, you know, a directive that codes and standards should now include climate resilience. It's clear climate change is not debatable, et cetera. Now we know we need to adapt. And so that was the directive. Tens of millions of dollars went into the technical development of exactly what the measures should be that should be incorporated. And then when we get to implementation, we do have this system that is complex, and there are many, many, many stakeholders. There are sort of the entrenched benefits that people receive from continuing on their normal practice, especially on the regulatory side. You get a lot of pushback if you try to change people's behavior. That being said, I think that the opportunities like the Lytton fire, I think this presents a big opportunity. And having somebody like Chief Michell, who is as passionate as he is, we have an opportunity here, I think, to apply these measures and show that it's not difficult, and take the story and promote it with the right partners. And I think also coming from, we've been doing this for a long time, initially from the disaster mitigation perspective, disaster management, which is increasingly being folded under the umbrella of adaptation. We're still viewed as sort of a fringe interest group, especially even mitigation, disaster mitigation within emergency management is a fringe concept. It's all focused on recovery. But we're getting to the point where we can probably integrate ourselves more into the wider, into the bigger industry interests, notably insurance, who cover the damages here. And to use this as an opportunity, I think there's very good opportunity here. As I think my understanding, the way that homes are owned and contracts are issued for construction in Indigenous communities, where there's one contract, specific construction measures can be specified much more easily than in the free market, like what we have for normal home building. This could be used as an opportunity to apply these measures. I think we can find funding if we're looking for incentives by going to the right people with the right connections. So I think there's pushback, but there's an opportunity right now to address a lot of that.
Yeah, there is an opportunity. As you said earlier, there's demonstrated benefits to taking advantage of that opportunity. And this is not to say ignoring the ground up approach of, homeowners and the community have to guide this process. Communities have to guide this process. But when you suggest, and we know the research supports this, that the return on investment is 4-to-1, 5-to-1 on investing in this, it's crazy making that we're not doing it, given the enormous escalating costs of disasters. When we saw the pandemic curve early on and it looked like a hockey stick, the disaster risk costs, which, as you've also pointed out, are only covering measurable costs, not the emotional, psychological costs, not the long-term displacement, health costs, etc., is so steep that it's probably going to curve back on itself and collapse. So again, I don't know, Tina, if you have any thoughts on how do we break this log jam where we know what will work better, or at least we know some of what will work better. We know that those investments are both necessary and actually economically make sense. We know that there are significant changes that even without systems change, significant changes that would benefit. And Chief Patrick, you talked about not even that regulations and zoning, et cetera, is such a limiting factor, even though we need it in the day-to-day, but it's such a limiting factor in this context. I don't know if you've encountered, Tina, any examples of where we globally have managed to do better.
Well, I think I want to answer that a little bit different,
Okay.
Robin, because I was born in Denmark. I'm actually here right now, but I've lived in Canada for the last 17 years. So I still have a bit of an outside perspective to Canada as a country. And one of the things that has always blown me away is just how enormous that country is and how many resources it has versus a relatively small population on that land base. And I think it's probably one of the reasons why there's a lot of resistance to change, because because I'm also Canadian now, we have this notion that we are in a land of abundance and this is not going to hurt us. And because ever since I moved to Canada, I've been screaming bloody murder that we need to start adapting to climate change, because we can't simply just mitigate ourselves out of this problem. It just isn't going to happen, because when you're dealing with adaptation or with climate change, there is a 5 to 10 year lag time. Yeah. So what's hitting us right now, we actually created it 5-10 years ago. So even if we stop all the emissions today, we still have 5-10 years more damage coming straight at us, right? So that means that with the hat that I've been wearing in my professional life, it's always looking forward and backwards, right? Like, what did we do 10 years ago that's going to hit us now? And what are we continuously doing that we will have to then prepare for the next 10 years going forward? And I think this is where Canada has really shot itself in the foot by thinking that, as long as we just all start driving electrical cars and do this and that, and we can mitigate ourselves out of this problem, it isn't going to happen. Mm. And so that's point number one. And luckily, I think the tides are changing. Paul Hawken, he was being interviewed in the Tyee recently, and he phrased it perfectly. He was saying, if you're looking at climate change as a conceptual challenge, it's very, very difficult for a lot of people to deal with it. And you and I both know that because we've dealt with climate change deniers for most of our professional career. But what he was saying is the minute it becomes experimental, then people start realizing, oh my God, this is going to affect me as well. So now that, especially all the ones of us here in BC, we have experienced the heat dome and the consequences of that, and all our garden, all our vegetables just completely fried on the plants and whatnot, right? And sadly, you know, what Chief Patrick and all his constituents have been at the receiving end of in Lytton, it's horrendous. I think it might just have been enough of a wake-up call for us to say, okay, even if we might not have the political will because it's fairly short-term focused, if we start creating some real movements from the private sector and the communities and just start doing and not necessarily waiting for the cavalry, and also keeping an eye on what's going on overseas, because there are so much to be learned from the Scandinavian countries, from Germany, from developing countries that I've been working in that can be directly applied to our situation here. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And that's actually sometimes being a latecomer to a show. You know, you have the advantage if you're open to it that you can draw on lessons gained from so many other people. And so I'm like Chief Patrick. I think we just need to roll up our sleeves and do it, but really look at what has been happening elsewhere and learn from that.
Thank you. I mean, and as you've all talked about, there are examples of people doing it. And I would say, I shared earlier in the chat a couple of films. One is particularly the second one that I shared, which is a colleague of yours, Tina, you know, that really looks at wildfire and forest management and this critical need, which has surfaced and is now becoming much more a part of the conversation of integrating traditional indigenous practices of forest and wildfire management, which were much more effective than anything colonial practices have offered in that regard. And, you know, the resurgence of cultural burning and other practices like that, we need to be both highlighting those and amplifying and extending those. And there are other strategies, Dan, you've mentioned some in terms of, you know, incentivizing, whether it's through insurance or through, I mean, the process of regulation and zoning change is so slow, but where we can, influencing our governments and getting our governments to create and support these opportunities in the context of recovery and I completely agree with what you said earlier, which is not to diminish the suffering and the trauma of the fire on Lytton, and not to diminish that the fire recovery process has to be directed by people who live there, not by people like me outside. And at the same time, exploring the opportunity of Lytton becoming an exemplar of, you know, resilient recovery that takes into account climate change and really looks towards the future and says, we're not going to be in this position again because we will rebuild in a way and bring alive that term, build back better. So that build back better includes fundamentally an orientation around climate and climate adaptation. So with that, we've only got 5 minutes left. I'm just going to invite each of you to take a minute and say, you know, if there was one thing that you would like to see happen in this space of climate informed or climate driven disaster recovery, really with this focus on resilience. And yes, it's, you know, there are limitations on resilience, but this idea that we can be doing a whole lot better, what would that be? So I'll start with you, Chief Michell. What's the one thing that you would like to see happen? And then I'll go to you, Dan, and you, Tina.
I spoke earlier about change management and adoption curve. You need to share success stories. What Kanaka Bar is doing is absolutely crazy. Some of my videos have had almost 50 views. Nobody gives a shit about climate change, resiliency, and success stories. The problem is, then they're the first ones to run out and say, oh, Sakura, my house is burnt down. So what we need to do here is, I just wanted to say, look, share the success stories. If Kanaka Bar can do it, so can the world. But I do want to comment one more thing. How do we pay for it all? It's called own source revenues. I wasn't begging federal and provincial dollars. When you're faced with an existential crisis, get off your ass and do something. It's what we did for 8,000 years. What we learned over the last 150 years since colonization was to depend on others to save you. That's not how it works. We need to work together, yes, but I can't wait for people in Ottawa or Scotland to make decisions for me. I'm capable of making decisions for me. And as a result, I'm going to be okay. My family's going to be okay. My community is going to be okay. And collectively, my region will be okay.
Thank you for that. Self-determination, self-governance, and moving forward without waiting. Dan?
Well, I guess I would close with the highlighting the importance of the experience of those who have been affected by disasters. And there's a specific case. So Moore, Oklahoma, city in the US, was hit by EF5 tornado. Several people were killed, many homes destroyed. The city worked on in the US, you can regulate buildings at the local level. They developed a tornado protection guideline that initially received significant resistance, pushback from the building industry. They organized a session that included the public, the residents that were affected by the tornado, whose lives were destroyed in many cases, and the building industry, and presented the measures there and confronted the industry about why they can and can't apply these measures, which were relatively small incremental costs. And they were successful in applying these measures. I think we can't leave, not just for the benefit of Lytton, but for the benefit of those thousands of other communities that are in the same position in Canada. We need to take these opportunities and apply them. I think waiting for regulation, like I was saying, it's going to take forever. These are the opportunities we need to draw on.
Thank you, Dan. So again, this idea of not waiting, taking advantage and sharing these examples is really critical. Tina, 1 minute, what would you say absolutely needs to happen? That was the one thing.
Well, first of all, I couldn't agree with Chief Patrick more. Whatever he said is actually what I was going to say. But really, self-determination. I live on Salt Spring Island, and there was an amazing group of volunteers that got together and updated the 10-year-old Salt Spring Island Climate Action Plan, and they took it to a whole new level, included adaptation. They didn't have the money, they worked for free. And then when the final plan was on the table, then the money started coming in. And they essentially anchored the implementation of the plan in Transition Salt Spring, which is a community-based organization. And now they are applying for grants. And private citizens that are concerned about what's going on, they are now becoming monthly donors. And you start by doing what you can, and then you make a lot of noise about it, you spread the word, and then you, as also Patrick was saying, you document what you're doing in terms of success stories, what works, but also what doesn't. And for instance, one result is that they have really promoted this whole notion of fire smarting on the island. We had very, very dry conditions this summer. They are working with, so also creating new partnerships that you're not necessarily used to doing, that they partner with the fire department on coming up with guidelines, home assessments, and learning by doing. And it really is working, and they're doing it sector by sector. So power to them.
Thank you again, Tina, for echoing some of what Chief Michell said and adding to that. I'm going to finish off here with one final slide, but I do want to echo, and many of you have been very active in the chat. I'm going to highlight Gareth again, just because I saw a comment and it's such a great quote to finish off before we talk about what's coming up. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has, which is a quote from Margaret Mead. And here we are. This is a time, it's said often, it's said in multiple contexts, but ultimately we have to move this forward. And me, you, each one of us has to think about how we do this, and we can't afford to wait. We have to work alongside, but we also have to take action where we can. So thank each one of you, Tina, Chief Mitchell, Dan, for your wonderful presentations, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom in this. Thanks everyone who participated in the chat. We'll save the chat and the webinar is recorded, and we'll share that out. And if presenters are comfortable, we'll share as well PDFs of their presentations. I just want to highlight a couple of upcoming webinars. As I said, this is part of a series. An upcoming webinar of interest is going to focus on COP26. It's a panel discussion called Hopes and Dreams, and that's October 20th at 11:30, and that one's sponsored. It's going to be hosted by Dr. Ann Dale from the School of Environment and Sustainability at Royal Roads. We also have another webinar coming up in October on escalating wildfires, adaptation and mitigation strategies for communities and forests. And finally, look for the ongoing series from the McCall program, the MA in Climate Action Leadership Program. We have an ongoing series of webinars. We will be following this webinar up with some more discussions about not just wildfires, but this intersection of disasters and adaptation and building in a future that we want to live in. If you want more information on the program, you can see the link there for the McCall program. You can also check out, and I think it was put in the chat earlier on, and Vivian, if you're still on in the panel, you can maybe put it in again. The Adaptation Learning Network is another project here at Royal Roads. It's a project of the Resilience by Design Lab, and there's a lot of resources there as well on adaptation. So with that, I'll thank each and every one of you. It's been a pleasure and an honor, and we look forward to seeing you again in upcoming webinars. Take care and have a great day.